I'm Lorna Schumann with the Illinois State Museum, and today we're going to talk about the types of food that people would grow and eat in the Cahokia and other Mississippian sites. So we're not going to so much look at the meat that they ate, but the plants that they grew. It's kind of hard for us to imagine now that really the United States and good portions of the Americas were really not a wilderness area, but they were much more farmed or managed areas for almost as much as 4,000 years. That's really a long time. There were lots of farmers, lots of people who were managing, collecting, making sure that certain plants grew in certain areas for a long time here in the Americas. And that would be true here in Illinois. Now, when we think about the Mississippian people who lived at Cahokia and other sites, there's probably one food source that really pops out to you as to what they actually grew and ate. Can you think of what that food source would be? How many of you guessed corn? Yes, that's what we really think about when we think about it. But corn actually came from Mexico. That's where it actually was started. But here's the thing. We know that people that lived here in Illinois didn't just grow corn. In fact, even going further back to the woodland period, which was pre-2000 BC or 4,000 years ago, there's evidence that shows us that the people grew squash, sunflowers, marsh elder, which is really a type of grasses, and bottle gourds, those big gourds that you can see that they might have scraped out for holes. All of those things. But they also grew something that archaeologists refer to as the Eastern complex crops. I know, you're going, what? What that just mainly means is that it was grown in the eastern United States, and it was a bunch of different plants that they actually grew as crops. So in other words, they managed it. And those types of plants were really starchy seed crops, so they were gathering the seeds of those. Now, one of them you heard was marsh elder, but marsh elder really wasn't part of the eastern complex crops. The ones that were chenopod, erect knotweed, maygrass, and little barley. So all of these had little tiny seeds on them that they would collect and eat on them. But there's also something else that was very strongly shown. Remember we mentioned squash? Well, the type of squash that they would have grown was the Kushna squash. It was large, very huge. It's what we today would refer to as a winter squash. That means that it has a hard shell. Unlike the summer squash that you might grow in your backyard or buy at the grocery store most of the time, that's really soft. You can eat the outside of that. But the winter squash is really hard shells. And the Kushna squash was really green and white striped. It kind of looks like a bowling pin, except it has a little curve at the top. And it's 12 to 18 inches long and weighs about 10 to 12 pounds. That's huge. People still grow this today. But that squash was an ancient crop that had been domesticated. In other words, people managed it so that they could grow it in their garden because they liked the food. They thought it added a good food source. And it was actually domesticated between 10 to 5,000 years ago. That's really old. We don't really think about that. Now here's something. So we know that they had all those eastern complex crops of the chenopod, the knotweed, the maygrass, and the little barley. But they also had the corn, they had the squash, they grew sunflowers and marsh elder. But you know what else? They grew so many different crops that really benefited them in a lot of ways because they didn't have to rely on just one crop like corn to survive. And here's the other thing. Not all of those crops bore their mature grain, that means their seeds, at the same time. And in fact, maygrass and little barley ripened or became ready to actually harvest in May and June, which is really much earlier than other times. Now here's something else you may not have thought about. When we think about people who do the farming, who do you see as being really farmers? Well, at Cahokia and the Mississippian sites, women were really the ones doing the farming. I know that sounds a little strange from what many of us have thought of as the farmer, but that's what would happen. And so they managed the fields. Now that also meant that the kids would help. But here is one crop men did grow, and that was tobacco. And tobacco really was not from here. It was used for some ceremonial purposes, and it really came from South America and the west coast of the United States. And men actually managed it, probably starting as late as almost 5,000 years ago. That's a long time ago. So when we look at this, chenopod and maygrass might have been the most abundant crop. How do we know this? Archaeological excavations. That's where archaeologists go out and look at the different things left behind by people long ago. So in this case, the Mississippian time period. And what they would do is gather some of the dirt and the remains left at these sites, and they would actually sift it and use different processes to pull out different seeds. And once they had done those seeds, what they would find is that there was a whole wealth of food, plant foods that they used. So here's some of the nuts that they actually found in the archaeological excavations. Are you ready? I bet you might know some of them. Hickory, pecan, black walnut, hazelnut, and acorn. That doesn't sound too different from some of the ones that we eat today. But guess what? They also have fruits. And I bet some of these fruits you might recognize, and some are probably pretty new. So fruits were persimmons, strawberries, plums, cherries, brambleberry, black nightshade, grape, elderberry, mulberry, and black hop. Now some of those berries and fruits I've heard of. Some of them I've never seen. But you know what? There were crops that they had. And what they found out with the crops is that these crops were found in huge amounts. So what are the crops that they had? Corn, of course. But corn wasn't always the most common till towards the end of the Mississippian period. It wasn't really more common till after 12,000 AD. Now, what else did they found? They found an eastern squash, Kushna squash, bottlegourd, tobacco, maygrass, chenopod, elect knotweed, little barley, sunflower, and something we haven't mentioned yet called silkweed. There were also some other plants that they found, but not in high amounts. So when they sorted everything out, they could count how much they used of these plants by seeing how much showed up in the archaeological evidence. So some of these other plants were like certain types of grasses, amarantha, which is a whole grain, and wild bean or trailing wild bean or fuzzy bean. It has all those. It wasn't like the beans that we have today. Well, my friends, we mainly talked about plants. And there were lots of animals too that also supplemented or added to the diet of the people from the Mississippian sites. Things that we know that are also left in the archaeological record. Things like deer, mussels, fish, rabbit, various types of birds, and many other types of animals. So you can see the people from the Mississippian time period and from Cahokia had a very diverse type of diet. Well, I hope you learned a lot more about the types of foods that they grew in the Mississippian time period. And I hope you can start thinking about what they might have used those foods for and how they actually managed them. Thanks for joining me, my friends. Take care.